Hello, second graders. Last time you were able to draw a cupcake, and you can see my example of my cupcake here. That was a pumpkin cupcake with a little caramel drizzle on top. Today it's time to add color to these, and we're going to use watercolors to do that. Let's take a little look before we get going at our watercolor techniques and what you have. So this is the watercolor set that we sent with you, and there's a little wooden brush that's in there, and that brush should do fine for you today. There were also some smaller detail brushes in your blue folders, but I don't think you'll need them because this brush is pretty small and detailed already. So you should be able to just use the one that came with your watercolor set. So with this, we're going to talk a little bit about our watercolor techniques. Most of these things you've heard from us before, but we just want to make sure you remember the rules, take care of your paintbrushes, and take care of your paint. So the first thing that we remember is that watercolor brushes are usually kind of soft and fluffy, and so they don't like getting squished. They want to be nice and soft and stay kind of in their nice pointy ways. If you leave them sitting or you squish them, then they get bent and they don't paint as nicely. So we want them nice and straight and not squished. So when you go in your water, you just gentle swish. I usually swish the bottom a little bit, and then I wipe it off on the top so I don't have too much drippy water. And then whenever I get over to my paints, I want to make sure that I am not squishing it here as well. So I'm going to start my cupcake today doing the plate. So if I start with the plate, I'm going to make mine blue. And I'm going to keep, if you can see, my paintbrush is staying up on its toes. I'm not squashing it down. I'm keeping it up on its toes, spinning around. I often tell my students it's like watching a ballerina dance up on her tippy toes. You keep your brush up on her toes or his toes, then you will get a really nice paint line. So my paintbrush is loaded and ready to go. I'm going to start by outlining the plate with that nice thin brush. And you can see that it kind of gets thinner and thicker as I push harder and lighter. Again, I had to reload. I'm going to use that tippy toes and paint around the edge. And then I'm going to kind of fill in, trying to follow the curve that I made. So one of the things when we paint, we try to follow the lines, not just stay inside the lines, but follow the lines in the way that the object would move, right? And this is an oval kind of circular object. So when you think of its shadows would follow that same kind of pattern. So I'm working my way around painting inside this. And the reason I paint the plate first is because you can see the plate tucks behind the cupcake here. And so as we work, we want the overlapping to make sense. So the cupcake is in front of the plate for our purposes of painting. So as you see that coming up here, you want to make sure that the things that you paint in the background are first, and then you paint the things that get closer to us as you go. So our plate is painted. And then we'll come back in and add some layers to do some shadowing at the very end. But for now, I'm just getting these kind of painted in a basic way. So now that the plate is painted, I'm actually going to skip the wrapper and work on the cupcake itself. And the reason I do that is because if we paint something that's wet right here, and then we paint the next spot next to it, and these two are both wet, then they like to bleed together. So since we're doing this all in one day, we're going to do every other spot. So we're painting the plate first, then we're going to skip to the cupcake, then we'll skip kind of back down to the bottom of the wrapper and work our way up, and then we'll come up and we'll do the frosting. Kind of work this back and forth so that our wet spots have a chance to dry before we work on the next place. So my cupcake is kind of a light brown, maybe with a little bit of an orangish brown to it. What I'm actually going to do is I'm going to paint it with orange first because I want to lighten that brown up so it's more like a pumpkin color. You can decide on your colors. You can layer paints. So I'm using lots of water and just filling in just the spot that is cupcake. And again, like I said before, when I was doing the plate, I'm following the contour of the cupcake. So the contour is kind of the way that it moves or bends. So my cupcake is rounded, so I'm following the rounded form of my cupcake. And once it's filled in, Like I said, I don't want it to be super orange, really. I want it to have a little bit of an orange tinge with some brown. While it's still wet, I'm going to come back and switch. Remember how we load our brush, tippy toes? Load it up. I'm going to put that up on top. So you can see where I finished. I just paused for a little bit to finish it up. So I finished adding the brown on top of the orange. So you can see how now it's not quite so bright orange. It's more of an orangey browny color, just like a pumpkin pie or a pumpkin cupcake would be. So now, like I said, we kind of want to work every other. So if I work right along this edge right away, I might end up having it get a little bit where the colors bleed together. I don't want that to happen. So I'm going to start on the bottom and work my way up, but also really follow this pattern of striping that goes up. So this is how that's going to work. I'm going to start it and then I'll pause and finish and you'll be able to see how it gets finished because you don't want to watch me do the whole thing. So I'm going to choose a cupcake wrapper color. And I think for this one, I think I might do like a yellow wrapper for this one, kind of that fall colors that I'm thinking of. I'm going to stick with a yellow wrapper, loading my brush just the same way I have before, making sure my brush is nice and clean, especially going from any color to a yellow. It's hard to get your brush really clean enough to not mix that yellow because it's such a color that gets mixed really easily. And you can see that I'm working from the bottom and getting a nice outline from the bottom up. I'm trying to stay away from those wet areas right away. So I'm going to work my way up all these stripes. Kind of get them to the top, but bringing it up so that it doesn't blend in with that paint at the top. All right, so now you can see that I finished those stripes getting up from the bottom and kind of filling in that striped pattern. I want to get this yellow to kind of fill in without it being brighter than the stripes I just made, which is kind of tricky. So what I'm going to do is actually take and get just a little bit of yellow on my brush from the bottom and get this nice and wet right along the bottom half here because that's more solid where there's not as many stripes. So I'm going to fill this bottom in like this. Right, it's all painted in. Again, I'm keeping that brush, I'm not squishing it, I'm keeping it up on its toes as I paint and as I load. And then what I'm going to do is kind of stretch it up. So it kind of stretches into those spaces. So I'm using just my water and the paint that's already there, and I'm stretching it up. So get a little water and stretch that paint. So I'm not even using my paint anymore, I'm using the paint that's on my paper. And as I stretch it up, it kind of fills in the in-between spaces. And I might find some spots that just stay a little white, and that's okay because then it kind of gets highlights, and you can see how different spots have different color then. So now that I've got my paint done from top to bottom for most of my cupcake wrapper, we're going to go ahead and start on the frosting because we've given this a little bit of time to dry. So to decide what color frosting you want, I think, I would usually do kind of, this would be like a creamy frosting, but I think it's more fun to have some more color to it. So I think I'm going to put a red frosting on here, and then I'll do a little drizzle on top. So I'm going to use a red for my frosting. And you'll notice I have this caramely drizzle that's on here. So because that's there, I want to have the frosting go, but I want to skip around this space. So I want this to be kind of a lighter. When I say red, you see that it's the red here, but it's going to be more of a pink, just because watercolor red gets real light, and we don't want it to be super, super bright. We want it to be kind of a lighter kind of pastel color for these. That's really what makes them work. So the red is going to outline, start with. And this cupcake didn't have a lot of those ripples. It was a pretty smooth cupcake. I'll show you one that I painted with lots of ripples too, so you can get an idea for what that would look like. All right, so you can see that this one has that kind of outline of it filled in, but I left where the caramel drizzle is. So now I'm going to go in and kind of fill it from side to side, again, following the edges and kind of stretching that paint so you get some lighter spots and some darker spots. So I start on the edges and then stretch the paint in. All right, so we wrapped that part up. You can see how I went around the outside edges and kind of pulled it into the middle. and then kind of just got little bits of color in here in between the caramel or where the caramel drippings are going to be. So I want those to be kind of a rusty color brown. So we want to start with a brown to make that caramel dripping on top. So we're going to kind of take that, but because it's a caramely one, it's got a little bit of a like a rosy color or red color to it too. So I'm actually going to do just like I did with the orange and brown, only this time I'm going to put some red in there and a little yellow so it gets a little more. So I'm kind of layering my colors to really let that caramel kind of drip and color up. And you can see how I'm blending those as I go. So a little bit of brown, a little bit of red, a little bit of yellow, mixing them up to kind of get that caramely shiny. So this is kind of a tricky technique. And this is where my brush is. I'm going to load it a lot to make sure that I'm keeping those colors mixing and they're not drying out and then just layering. We want them to actually mix on the paper. So you can see that caramely drizzle on top then that kind of drizzles down. And then the last thing that was on this cupcake was the nuts, and they're right here and they're small. But what happens is I have all this water on my cupcake right now. So if I do those right now, they're going to just bleed in and we won't see them. So I'm going to leave them alone and completely forget them for today. We'll come back to them when we do our finishing touches next.